So, Stephen A. Smith, do you believe that some white people use the word thug as a code word or euphemism for the N-word?
Yes. Some, not many, not all, but some. And I told you yesterday, the ignorant few screech the loudest, and that's why it permeates.
Okay, so I don't know. Could you hear the first of the show when I was talking to Karen?
No, I did not.
Okay,
It was technical difficulties.
Okay,
I did not hear the first.
For our sake, your sake and mine, I'm going to have to repeat this.
Okay.
In my context, and I can only speak in my context, I grew up using the word thug only in a white-on-white context. Maybe I used it occasionally if a black man fit into this definition, but I'm talking about the literal definition for me. The dictionary definition of the word thug was in an underworld context, like mafia muscle, a hoodlum, a violent criminal. That guy's just a thug. And I might have used it, I don't remember, in the context of a black man, but it was mostly in the context of white people. But then, as I told Carrie, it's been, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, a black commentator, buddy of mine, pulled me aside and said, hey, just FYI, there are those in the black community who believe the word thug is a code word among whites for the N-word, which I've told you many times on this show is simply the most evil and ugly word in the human language. And as I've said many times, that's the word that, to me, that should be eradicated. So it's hard for me to make the leap from the euphemism thug to the most evil word in the language, the N-word. But as I told Carrie, if that's what you believe that white people do, I would never, that's up to you. That's what we always say about if any minority says, hey, I don't like that word, I don't like that reference, whatever that word might be, I will never even consider using it again, well, even though it was innocent in my heart the way I was using it. I wasn't using it as any code word in my younger days. So from that point forward, I never even thought about associating black man and thug because I knew you would take it very personally.
Well, you have to understand, you have to take everything in context. The word thug itself is only offensive really to those that know that it does not apply to them. Mm-hmm. You have some people that are proud to be perceived as thugs and don't necessarily embrace it that way. But when somebody in the black community alludes to the word thug being a code word for the N-word, what they're saying is that it's not about the word itself and the attachment to the other word. What they're saying is that white folks who are critical of black individuals, particularly the professional black athlete, they're usually talking about somebody black. If you heard white folks refer to other white folks in that way, if Richie Incognito, for example, just to throw his name out there, was called a thug, obviously you don't mean it in the same way. The problem is, if that happened, that would be an extreme aberration, because when you hear the word thug, it's not that thug means the N-word. It's that the word thug is usually reserved for somebody of African American descent. And it's usually being said by somebody outside of the black community. And that's the problem. So when we're talking about things from a contextual standpoint, what we have to look at is not just the words, not just the vocabulary or the vernacular that comes associated with it. We have to look at who's saying it about whom. That's what you're looking at. If Skip Bayless was talking about Richie Incognito and he used that word, there's nobody on this planet that's going to assume that the word thug is a code word for the N-word. But when all you do is turn around and see white commentators and white prognosticators associate that word with somebody of black African American descent, then you have a problem. So if you were fair about it with everybody across the board, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, and by the way, the Hispanic community could tell you they have issues with it too to some degree, because when I'm not just talking about black folks, I'm talking about minorities, which is why diversity has been so incredibly important, because when you have diversity, the concerns for such things dissipate significantly. And that's where the issue of fairness comes in.
Okay, I'm extremely happy we're having this conversation, if nothing more than to, we hope, enlighten some of our viewers as to the sensitivity with which they should use this word going forward. But I would be much more prone, speaking of the hockey fight that we just saw that Richard Sherman talked about, I would be much more prone, in my world, to calling a hockey enforcer a thug.
Right.
He would qualify as a thug to me.
That's fair.
And then, let me throw this at you. It threw me a curve yesterday when, deeper into Richard Sherman's remarks, he then used thug in the dictionary definition sense, because then he said, I know some thugs, and I'm the farthest thing from a thug. Well, now he's using it the way I would use it, as I said earlier, to describe a white guy, you know, just as a violent criminal, whatever. No?
No, let me explain that to you. And it's interesting that you bring that up. Very enlightening on your part. Let me say this to you, Skip. A lot of folks within the black community, when you look at thugs, or let's just say, for example, you look at those criminals like a drug dealer or something. I'm here to tell you right now, I am an educated black man. I have a college degree. I graduated with honors. I'm working for ESPN. Even though I have the greatest mother that I believe has ever walked the face of this earth, I am here to tell you a big reason as to why I'm alive and successful today is because of those quote-unquote thugs. Those dudes running the streets, those drug dealers or whatever, saved my life. Because when I was younger, when I was a teenager, the temptation was there to do what they were doing because it was a quick fix, quick money, or whatever the case may be. And they were like, no, that ain't you. That ain't going to be you. A matter of fact, one of them slapped me upside my head right at PS 192 Park on 204th Street in Hollis, Queens. Slapped the living mess out of me. Slapped me like I stole something because that was something that I was willing to entertain. He said, this ain't your world. This will never be your world. I made wrong decisions. You will not do it. And he made sure he had his crew around him to make sure I would never do such a thing. And it's because of that that I've never been in jail and I'm not dead, obviously. So when somebody like Richard Sherman, who's from Compton, is pointing out how he knows thugs, what he's saying is he knows that element. He knows guys connected to that element. And one of the things, Skip, that they absolutely detest and abhor, because you have a few, not many, not all, but a few professional athletes that have been guilty of this. And Kerry will understand exactly what I'm saying when I say this. You do have wannabe thugs out there.
For sure.
Guys who want to come across like they are harder and more streetwise and more connected than they really are. And nothing annoys a thug, a true thug, or a quote-unquote gangster more than that, because they know you have no business in this world. You have an opportunity to be away from it and be successful, yet you want to invite yourself into this. They have no respect for you because they believe they didn't have that opportunity that you did to do better, but you want to roam in their world. They have no respect for you. So when Richard Sherman was alluding to it, he's saying, trust me, I'm not those dudes. I'm not that hardcore. I'm not made of that. And they would be the first to tell you. And they have more respect for Richard Sherman than they would a wannabe thug, because he's somebody that recognizes he is not. He knows the distinct difference. And he elocutes that and highlights it. And that's something that he was asking the world to pay attention to yesterday.
Okay, I get that. To me, from what I know of Richard Sherman, he is the farthest thing, as he just said, from the dictionary definition of the word thug that I could imagine. That's the last thing I would think Richard Sherman is. But it, again, threw me a little bit of a curve that he would say, hey, I don't like the use of the word thug as a virtual code word for the N-word. Then he used it. So are we back to, as a black man, he can use that word thug to describe another black man, but a white man cannot use the word thug?
No, we're not back to that. What he's saying is he's asking people like yourself and our white brethren and contemporaries in this business to recognize and acknowledge what is offensive about it is that it seems something that's reserved for the black athlete.
Okay.
If you heard them talking about the white athlete and that, if Richie Incognito was called a thug. If somebody of white descent